Perfect. All right, let's get started then. So I'm Laura Thomas. I'm a chartered psychologist by background. I'm currently working across two different places. So one of them is PARSEC Spaceflight, which I've included here. So we're focused on developing, selecting, training, certifying the next generation of commercial astronauts, but it's sort of research and payload specialists as opposed to space tourists per se. I also work for a UK company called Happens, which is focused on leadership, resilience, and development. So I won't say too much more about me. There's my LinkedIn profile if you wanted to connect, and also my work email. Okay. So I'm here to talk about two analogues that I was involved with. So one of them was a North Pole expedition, and one of them was a research analogue in the Mojave Desert, so quite different. So the first half of the presentation, I'm going to talk about those two, and then the second half, I'm going to talk about the opportunities and challenges of analogues and how to mitigate some of that. And then at the end, it'd be great to hear from you. I know that some of you have done analogues. It'd be lovely to hear your experiences, maybe any stories you want to share regarding the opportunities and the challenges. That would be wonderful. So the North Pole team was the Before It's Gone North Pole expedition. We were basically collecting snow and ice and water samples to then analyze for the presence of key pollutants, which I'll talk about in a moment. We were an all-female team. There were 8 of us at various points on the expedition. Because it was such a long project, it was a 4-year project, and we did a number of expeditions, different team members were present for different parts of that. So I was lucky enough to be involved in an Iceland expedition. We went to the most remote glacier in Iceland, Drangajökull, and then the North Pole expedition, which happened just last month. So that was pretty special to be a part of that. And all of the pictures throughout are either from either of the analogues. So I'll explain a bit about what you can see here. So on the right, we've got the metal containers, and these were used to collect the samples that would be analysed for microplastics, obviously, so as not to contaminate the sample. And then we also had plastic containers, which were used to analyse samples for the presence of heavy metals like lead. And this research is really important because looking at the levels of pollutants in the most remote regions in the world gives a really good indicator of the state of our climate and what's happening and what's going to happen to the snow and ice that's there, hence Before It's Gone expedition. So yeah, there's some nice pictures of us collecting samples in different conditions. It was challenging at times, but also a lot of fun. This is a video of us doing the drill. So when it worked, that was quite a fun thing to do. So that was in Svalbard, so the sea ice wasn't too thick, but we couldn't get through. When we went up north recently, the ice was too thick, but it's fun to do. Oh, I just skip right to the end. Yeah, so we had another project that we were collecting samples for. So this is just measuring snow characteristics, so snow temperature, snow depth, the albedo of the snow, the grain size, particle size, the type of crystal. So that just gives data about each of the areas that we sampled. And then as part of this project, we were also looking at levels of black carbon in the snow. And black carbon is really important because it's one of the key accelerants of ice melt. So the black particles, so it is in the snow, and it just facilitates that warming process. So this is our sample box on the left here, which got really heavy after a period of time, so we had to lug about everywhere. We had 5 different sample boxes, so each of us had one in our sled. And I think by the end we were about 25 kilos each per box, so they're pretty hefty to lug around on top of all your gear, but that's what we were there for. And then this middle picture is Andrea. She's filtering, so she's melted the snow and now she's filtering it with a syringe through the filters, which you can see on the right here. And this is where the debris from the snow would collect. And it's quite tricky doing that in the field, as you can imagine. And when we went up north, we had the luxury of being able to bring those samples back to the hotel and do it at the hotel. But in Iceland and Svalbard, we had to do it in the field. We also had 2 psychology projects that we were part of. So one was at the University of Durham, and this was regarding resilience, and we had to fill out diaries and questionnaires every day, which sometimes when you're really tired and you have little time is a bit of a stretch, but that's also part of it, and that's what it's capturing, right? And also a project that is my research, which I'm now collaborating with PARSEC Spaceflight on as well. And this is regarding positive psychological outcomes following exposure to space analogues. And I'll talk a bit more later about what I mean by that and what that involves. But this is a mixed method study. So I'm measuring changes over a 6-month period, potentially longer. I'm using a version of something called the post-traumatic growth inventory, which is a popular inventory used for this type of research, and also the positive experiences of being in space questionnaire. So it's like a sort of custom. I'm also looking at qualitative themes as well. Okay, so that's a little bit about the North Pole expedition. The other one was through a company called Mars Moon Astronautics Academy and Research Science. So this was, again, an all-female crew. This was 8 women, but 18 members were there for the whole expedition. This was 10 days in the Mojave Desert, and we stayed in a portable habitat. So as opposed to the North Pole, this one is low fidelity, because even though we were remote, we would have been able to get help within a few hours, whereas the North Pole, I mean, it could have been days before we were able to get access to search and rescue. So that's the difference in fidelity there. So yeah, this mission was important because, as far as I know, it was the first all-female analog crew. The idea was that you live like astronauts while you're there, you conduct meaningful research relevant to space, and we also did a lot of outreach as part of this as well. So working with people from schools, which we were just talking about just before we started this presentation. So the habitat itself, you can see these interconnected pods, which look quite futuristic. And that was it. We were in there for 10 days, and you can see the inside on the left makes it look a little bit more spacious than it actually was in there. And then on the right, that's the view between the doors, and you kind of get this infinite mirror effect of just open doors, which was quite cool. So Susan, the owner of Mars, was quite keen that we have a full schedule, because depending on which research analog you're part of, you might not necessarily have a schedule. It's up to you. But she was keen that we have a schedule, because it helps with well-being and just, team cohesion and things. So we did a lot. We had daily briefings, debriefings. We got involved in scientific and research activities. Cooking seemed to take up an awful lot of time. I'm sure some of you can relate to that. Extravehicular activities, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. Lots of report writing as well. So each of us had a role. So we had like medical officer, executive officer, team commander, engineering officer. I was psychological officer, and every day we'd be writing up reports about, what had happened, any concerns, etc. And there were lots of group and individual activities as well, which we took part in, and these really helped. They helped the team, I think, get to know, help with morale. So we had creative exercises. So like the bottom left picture is painting in the dark, which was kind of fun, kind of silly. reflective exercises. The top left is a reflective exercise. We did a talent show, we had shared meal times, and we had celebratory events. So the picture on the bottom right is when we came out of sim and we had a bonfire outside and we cooked s'mores, and it was really good. Extravehicular activities. So this is when you go outside the hab and you simulate that process that astronauts go through, which, you kind of feel a little bit silly at first, getting kitted up in the suits and the helmets and everything, but you get used to it, and it's a good process to learn and go through. You go through like a decompression sequence, and then there's somebody inside at all times who's habcom, who's effectively mission control, who's coordinating what you're doing. You've just got radio to communicate. It's essential communication only. And we collected geographical data, so like soil samples to analyze. And we had like a dummy that we used as a patient, what would happen if somebody got injured. And then the nighttime EVAs were interesting because some people did report sort of feeling a bit, nervous, because you're out there alone in the desert. It's really dark. There's maybe coyotes, maybe you can hear them. So that did sort of add an element of that slightly higher fidelity, which was fun. We had 2 research projects as part of this analog. So one was by Dr. Sarita Dara. She's a senior medical officer in aviation and a human factors specialist. And she was collecting daily ratings of like fatigue levels, workload levels, sleep quality. And she's using that as a test bed for future research into sleep monitoring and assessment. And then my project, the one that I described before, was also running with MMARS participants. So it'll be interesting to kind of compare between different analogs and environments as to what those results might be. Okay, so this is now the second half where I'm going to talk about challenges of analogs. And this is from a famous paper by Leach, who kind of compares extreme environments to the effects of torture. It's the cumulative impact of small stresses that is what causes a lot of the difficulties in analogs. So whilst individual forms of duress can have a psychological impact, it's the clustering of these stresses that appears to be particularly difficult and damaging, producing impairment in exceptional, extreme and torturous environments. And in fact, the Antarctic polar winter over syndrome and the accompanying impaired cognitive function, which has been well studied, has been attributed to this cluster effect. And he breaks it down to 3 clusters. So the psychological component, the psychophysiological, and the psychosocial. And it's a bit like the idea of the Swiss cheese model. I'm sure that at least some of you know that. It's fine if you've got like 1 or 2 things that are, problematic, they're kind of minor, but when they all add up, and if they all add up in a certain way, that then can lead to a catastrophic event. So you've got to be really mindful of these small things and try and mitigate as much as you can. So just this, I've expanded on the list that Leach had, and I'm sure that you can think of more, but things like isolation, the sensory changes, the temporal disorientation, constant daylight on our polar expedition. If you're in Antarctica, you'd be in constant darkness over winter. The unpredictability, your routines can completely change. I actually only had a very brief period. We were on expedition, but we were in a tent for 2.5 days altogether where we just couldn't go anywhere. And that's a lot to be in a tiny space, 5 of you. There are some expeditions where they're maybe spending 7, 10 longer days just in a tiny little space, and it's a lot. But then when you're out there, you also then, when you're actually out in the environment on the ice, you're constantly vigilant. So you kind of go from, not much going on to then being fully on, trying to protect yourself. So there's a lot. Mitigation, there are things you can do. I'm sure you could add to this list as well. Screen for psychiatric history, allow people to have a say over their schedule, implement routines wherever possible and have them planned beforehand so that you're not making decisions when you're out there. You want things to become muscle memory. So things like tent routines, roles within the tents and who's doing what. We had to, on the first day, very quickly storm pitch a tent. It was a really bad storm. And if we didn't know already who was doing what or how to do that, it would have taken so much longer. And then you risk damaging equipment and things as well. So be prepared to change plans. We had to change our plan many, many, many times. You can't control the weather, you can't control the environment. You just got to be flexible. Understand your own coping tendencies and respect how others might differ. That's important to know and get to know. Have awareness of your own motivation, recognize how it's different to others. You can use rehearsal imagery, so practicing being in that environment like mentally beforehand and going through your routines. That can be helpful. And then you generally don't have much capacity in terms of the payload, but bringing a few home comforts or meaningful items can matter a lot. Okay, so psychophysiological. I mean, there's a lot here. The environment generally is trying to kill you. You've got extremes of temperature, risk of injury, risk of death. The key thing is the no access to help and how long it might be that help could arrive. So in Antarctica, you've got no access to help for months. In the North Pole, it was potentially days, potentially weeks. And in the Mojave Desert, it was hours. So all of that sort of determines how demanding the environment is and how much you need to think about beforehand. You've got disruption to your circadian rhythm. You're maintaining uncomfortable positions. You know, being in a tent, especially doing ice and snow camping, is a lot on the body. You're constantly shoveling snow, constantly. You're hunched over inside the tent. It's, you know, it adds up over time. And then, as I said, everything in the environment is trying to kill you. So it's a lot going on. Know as much as possible in advance about your environment. It's not always possible, but try and know as much as you can. Bring appropriate kit, bring a bit extra, not too much because you don't have extra weight, but a little bit. Have all members first aid trained, make contingency plans and distribute the equipment accordingly. So, you know, one person has the emergency shelter, one person has a tent, one person has a shovel, so that each of you could build something to protect yourself if you got split off. You must have a home or remote support team. You must have established links with search and rescue and understand their capacity and their limits. And be really careful of resource management. You know, we could have been stuck there for 10 days without help. So make sure you have enough fuel and food and all of that. Okay, psychosocial challenges. These can be insidious and people can underestimate the impact of this, you know, the team dynamics and just how big of a role that can play. You can get cliques forming quite quickly, actually. You can get people harboring grudges and resentment towards each other, a lot of passive aggressiveness sometimes. You do have that lack of external support, so you kind of have to manage it all within the team, which can be tricky. Things can escalate as well. I mean, thankfully, this doesn't happen as often, but it has happened, and I've heard stories of each of these things happening. You get physical altercations, you can get deliberate shaming of people in the team, and sexual misdemeanors. So you just have to be mindful of the potential for each of these things. It's so critical to get to know your team in advance. The longer that you're away for, the better you need to know your team. That's so critical. Daily briefings and debriefings can help. You should agree how to navigate conflict beforehand so that you kind of have a template to follow. You need to have frequent check-ins. Ideally, you want some sort of external or remote support team just to check into. You won't have any sort of meaningful or long dialogue with them probably, just because communication is very hard, but that would be great. And establish a process for the reporting of problems. That's really important so that everybody knows what happens and what to do. Okay, so I'm quickly going to talk about opportunities of analogues. So salutogenesis is a health and growth focused approach. And there's more and more research into this in extreme environments. So, you know, Nicole said, even though most researchers pointed to the drawbacks, there is mounting evidence that supports that these types of experiences can have really positive impacts on people. And that's what I'm looking at in my research with PARSEC and with MMARS. So it's rather than pathogenesis, thinking about a sort of wellness approach. And then in this review by Rich et al., they talk about how in places like polar research stations and submarines, people have achieved gains in areas such as stress tolerance, morale, and task performance. So one of the key ways in which this is measured is looking at something called post-experience growth. So this is measured through that post-traumatic growth inventory, because they're very much related concepts, but we call it post-experience growth in analogues because, I mean, there might be a traumatic experience that happens there, but generally it's a stressful environment rather than a traumatic environment. So that's why we use a slightly different term. But the idea is that we're measuring growth that surpasses a baseline level of resilience. So you're not looking at how people cope moment to moment or how people bounce back. We're looking at sustained types of growth that are maybe more fundamental to a person. So a change in values or a change in motivation that's happened as a direct result of being exposed to that extreme environment. So there are some results from a recent systematic review of analogues around this and the positive impacts. And I think they had 12 studies in all that fit their criteria, but they have a lot of people within those. So 723 participants who were in an extreme environment for at least a month, mainly male, as the data is at the moment, but hopefully expeditions like ours are changing that. And the most common findings across those studies, both quantitative and qualitative, were perceived increases in these two dimensions from the post-traumatic growth inventory. So the idea of personal strength and new possibilities. So even though the qualitative studies weren't kind of fitting things into those categories from the inventory, the findings still fit within them. So it's just a simple way of kind of understanding that data. So, for instance, with personal strength, a feeling of self-reliance is a big one. And on the next slide, I'll talk briefly about a seminal study where that was a really key finding. So knowing that you can handle difficulties, feeling confident in the way that you conduct yourself. And then new possibilities, so developing new interests, being more open to things in your life, feeling more equipped and able to do things. So I thought those findings were pretty interesting. Those results included studies from like solo sailing expeditions, Antarctic expeditions, patrol teams in northern Greenland. One of them, so this was a seminal study, was of US Navy crewmen in Antarctica, and they did an overwinter there. And as well as increased feelings of self-reliance, they found that 20% of those participants, and this was a big study, by the way, I think it was 358 people, they had 20% fewer hospital admissions for the remainder of their military duties, so 5 to 13 years compared to a control group, which is pretty big. And just something to note as well, it seems to make a difference how much time you're spending in that environment. So more time seems to lead to more growth. Although there's some conflicting evidence if you're a solo expeditioner where maybe it leads to sort of more negative experiences, but we need more research to clarify that. But there's a few studies that really seem to highlight that more time equals more growth. Okay, just on the last couple of slides now. So we can also consider correlates of post-experience growth. There's not much in this field at all. So by correlates, I mean factors that are associated and potentially even predictive of post-experience growth. So, if we know that, we can factor that into things like selection processes and help to facilitate those things. So these results are from a study of 83 mountaineers. And using the 5-factor model of personality, it seems that 2 traits, that's how open you are to other people, how much you get on with other people, how much you like being sociable and getting on with other people, how pleasant you are to deal with, and how open you are to your own experiences. So your own emotional and psychological experiences seem to be associated with increases in post-experience growth. Similarly, higher levels of perceived stress actually were, and maybe that makes more sense. There's more there to facilitate that shift and that change in your schemas and in your cognitions. And one thing that was recommended from this systematic review, which was the 2023 study by Nicole et al., they talk about how the role of cognitive appraisal or meaning making is something that you could actually maybe facilitate into training for people going into analogs, because there's an evidence base on cognitive appraisal. So what I mean by that is something bad happens or something that is disappointing or kind of creates a bit of a mark in you in some way. The way that you evaluate and interpret that event can have a significant impact on the emotional state that you're left in afterwards. And cognitive reappraisal is a whole component of cognitive behavioral therapy. And there's an evidence base supporting those techniques for things like helping with depression, for post-traumatic stress disorder. So there's definitely mileage to think about cognitive reappraisal in this field of analogs and post-experience growth. We already know that it's a predictor, a strong predictor of post-traumatic growth. So being able to, change how you look at a failure or not meeting your goal or is probably quite important for how much growth and how much you get out of a challenging and difficult experience. So yeah, I think that's me. So let me come out of this and then maybe I'll come back to here because I really want to hear from all of you as to any thoughts or impressions about that.
Well, I first of all, you and I know each other, and I'm glad you shared some of those images because I was really curious how things went. Looked like it went really well. And by the way, I'm going back. We're leaving into this month, and we're spending a month up there. So,
wow.
yeah, I'm looking forward to. This is the second year in a row, and I find that talk about ice as an environment, right? Not just ice. Holy moly! So fascinating, Laura. Really cool to see. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no worries at all.
Laura, I
Yeah.
just want to say I worked in the oil field, in the gas field, a couple of shifts in Arctic onshore drilling rigs. So I had a shift for 3 months, and I stayed there in winter, Siberia -40. But the fun part was that our drilling rig exploded, and we had to kind of I was just an interpreter, so my job was easy. But it was kind of weird environment, and I stayed for the whole thing. And just my memories is that it was a long time ago. So when I came back out of that, I had this feeling that I lived through all that, awkward lifestyle, but at the same time, pretty cool because before the whole thing exploded, it felt like a Mars space station base, like several units and Russians, Ukrainians, Americans, British, Germans, all kind of people worked there together. This was a really cool experience. And then the whole thing blew up. And that experience gave me a new reference point in the later life. Now everything I would come across, I will measure that against the stuff I lived through, and I became less shy, more confident at that time, and slightly more brave. I would do things which I would not have done before. And this was an interesting experience, somewhat in line with what you described. And also, since I had so many new stories, which I can tell to people, I became a more interesting person.
Right.
So yes, this interesting experience changed you a lot, assuming you survive there. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, assuming you survive. No, that's fascinating. And actually, maybe you'd be a great participant for my research. And that sounds like it was quite a transformative experience with again those lasting effects that that post-experience growth. Yeah, that's amazing.
I just in case I'm not interrupting anyone, Laura, you and I know each other as well. I may not be an analog astronaut like you, incredible people, but Laura, congratulations on everything you've accomplished. This is just incredible. And you are forever awe-inspiring. I'm just really curious to know, how did you get involved with these experiences anyway? So I think you did the Mojave Desert first, didn't you?
Yeah.
And in the Arctic expedition. How did you get involved with both of those?
Yeah. So it's a good question. I think analogs are also more common now. Well,
Yes. Yeah.
not like really common, but they're becoming more common. So it is easier to get into analogs. But this was through a sort of prolonged process of networking, really. So Susan, who's the head of MMARS, I'd actually met a couple of years back. Again, through networking through various people, I was invited to a group of sort of space entrepreneurs and space professionals, and I met her through that group. And then we kind of we drifted out of contact. And then I happened to be in California last summer, and I was like, do you know what? She's based here. I'm just going to get in touch. And then things went from there. And then she invited me on the analog with the team. So that was, yeah, just a case of sort of keeping up with people who are in the right places and the right positions. And then similarly with the North Pole expedition. So our team leader is a lady called Felicity Aston, who's a British polar explorer. She's done lots of expeditions in her own right and has lots of experience. And she's somebody who I knew that I wanted to connect with. She's a brilliant woman. And she does talks from time to time in London. So I went to see one of her talks and, spent a bit of time with her afterwards, and we kept in touch. And then I saw that she was advertising a trip to Ethiopia, like a trekking trip. So I went and did that with her, which was wonderful because it was an amazing trip, but it also meant that we really got to know each other. And then when the North Pole expedition came up, I wasn't part of the team originally. It was a 4-year project. So I was kind of in reserve somewhere because there are so many incredible women who went on that trip. But then just because of circumstance, people had to drop out because, COVID delayed things. Then there was the war between Russia and Ukraine. So things got pushed back, and it meant that as team members left, I could step in. So that was a mix again of sort of networking, persistence, time, and luck, ultimately.
Power of networking. That's incredible, Laura. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, it's lovely to see you here as well.
Cheers.
Oh, it's interesting. I know Susan and Emmy and Salam pretty well, actually.
Yeah.
And the dynamic, so the mission we have coming up, three ladies, 4 guys, so it's 4 and 3. I tried to get 50-50. It was very hard to get another woman on the mission, but I managed. And so I'm really excited to see how that dynamic works. It's as scary, and you mentioned it. And I felt that last year, and I'm imagining you felt it often. Like every moment was a potential dangerous moment, unless you're just cautious and slow and methodical. And how did that feel post mission? Did you notice the difference?
It's okay. I don't know if this is quite answering your question, but I'll say it and then we'll see if it's one of those things. It's when you're there in the moment, and I'm thinking particularly now about the North Pole expedition, just because the extremes of temperature make it so much more difficult. The Mojave Desert, luckily we weren't there at the hottest times of year. It was still hot, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't like, this could kill you kind of heat. Whereas the North Pole, this could definitely kill you, with the temperatures that we had. The whole time that you're there, you're just thinking about not being there. And you're like, why did I do this? Why did I do this every time? Like, why did I sign up to this again? Like, what am I thinking? Why do I keep putting myself through this? But then, it's that like type A, type B, where you come out of it and you're like, oh, that was brilliant. Like, I'd love to go and do that all again. It's the reward, it's the payoff for what you do.
Laura, the science looks spectacular, what you're able to pull out of that. So we're doing a nanoplastic study up there,
Oh, yeah.
micro. But I'm really keen to visit after. I know you and I've talked before, so I'll track you down. I dropped a note in LinkedIn there a minute ago, so just to kind of follow up. But yeah, brilliant, really interesting talk. Always fascinating. Thank you for the time.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Yeah.
Very welcome. Thank you for listening. Just trying to see who else we've got. Oh, we've got a couple of my colleagues here from PARSEC. I just briefly mentioned about PARSEC, but hi Dirk, hi Christian.
Hi, how's it going?
Good, good, good.
You're putting the spotlight on me. I guess I have to turn on the camera. So
Oh, no, you don't have to. I was just saying hello. I'm also saying hello because I know that you've been in analogs, and I wondered whether there was anything around, this sort of the challenges and the opportunities that resonated.
yeah, to be honest, not quite. I think there's nothing comparable to what you did that I was going through. So yeah, I wish I could relate to, but I think especially the big North Pole thing was quite far off from my experiences.
Yeah, it's a time factor as well. Our expedition got cut really short, which was, the last slide about cognitive reappraisal. I think some of us, had to do some of that because we were expecting a 14-day expedition. Iceland was 10 days, Svalbard was 10 days. We were expecting a 14-day expedition, maybe more if we got stuck. But we went down to 6 days, which is quite a drastic difference. So yeah, I think the time that you spend in that environment does make a difference.
Yeah, for sure. Looking forward to all the other more extreme experiences in the future.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Dirk, how long was PARSEC, Dirk? How long were you guys in there?
So, yeah, the project is ongoing for about 2.5 years now. So we kind of got out of stealth mode beginning of this year, more or less. So
I remember
still in the early shoes.
Note, yeah, and it seems like it's going well. At least it looks like it from the outside looking in.
Yeah, I think we're doing good progress. It's always also kind of a plan to keep the progress slow so that we have some steady but good progress. But yeah, we're also feeling at the moment that once you get a little bit more public attention, there's also some more pressure coming up. So
well, I won't put expectations on you yet, but maybe. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. No, I think now we have an awesome psychologist on board, so we can handle stress.
And so that's a good question, Laura. We need a crew psychologists, and we can visit with offline. We have Starlink, and I know you and I had a quick chat about it, but maybe I could deeper dive to that. I really feel like that's an important part of a team, right, on the ground.
It really is, and that's a good point, because what was interesting was that even though, well, especially in the North Pole expedition, I wasn't there as a psychologist, but yet automatically you become the person that people go to. You become the confidant. So that was interesting to see. It's going to happen anyway. There's going to be somebody who people go to, who they gravitate towards, and that's because it's needed. As I said, you've got this cumulative effect of stresses. It's difficult. That grates on people, so they need a supportive person there. So yeah, it is. I would encourage you to take one on.
Well, that actually makes me curious then, obviously the psychologist now, that is the person that people go to for aid, for whatever that is. But then do you ever feel that pressure? Do you feel that, people, I'm taking on so much and I don't know who else to go to because people keep coming to me? Have you ever felt that? And do you think that that is a problem then, that if a psychologist was to go to space would encounter?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I suppose in space, although with longer missions, communication with mission control becomes very difficult. But ordinarily you would have somebody on the ground supporting you as well. Or maybe what happened in the Mars expedition was me and Tammy, the medical officer, worked very closely in alignment, so we would kind of draw off each other and refer to each other, and it was wonderful having that source of support. Often you find the medical and the psychologist kind of gravitate towards each other. for that reason. So it's a great question, and it is something to be mindful of. Everybody needs, you know, some way of decompressing and managing their own stress.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's as you know, Terry said it. I think it's beneficial more than ever to have a psychologist on board. It's a shame though, because a lot of, you know, for instance, European Space Agency, they one of their requirements to be an astronaut is to have a hard STEM subject, and psychology, unfortunately, is not one of those. So I'm just imagining the possibilities that we have if they recruit psychologists as astronauts, if they add that in that area.
Tahani, this has been a running frustration of mine. I remember going to a talk back in 2016, a wonderful doctor who went to Antarctica called Beth Healy, and she told me that they do loads of psychological research out there, but it all goes onto the medical doctor to do that and to monitor that. And it's like, I understand that you have to maximize skill sets. I understand that in an emergency, of course, you need a medic there. You need that. And, you know, there's a limited amount of places. But at the same time, it's quite minimizing and dismissive to think that my 8 years of training is somehow equivalent to somebody who's, you know, have very minimal training in that area. And it's a missed opportunity, is how I feel about that.
Absolutely. And as you can even make the argument with your own experience in the Mojave Desert, having a crew medical officer that, having the your doctor colleague there and you there together made a huge difference. So absolutely.
Oh, it did. It did. And the team factors were, I think, everything sort of went better because of that. We had that sort of conjoined support. Yeah, I mean, let's hope that things change. It is really important to have a STEM degree. And I actually, you know, part of the reason why I got an additional STEM degree was so that, you know, you just want to be taken more seriously. You know, I can do this. I have the skills. I have the hard skills. I have the mathematical skills. Take me seriously.
Yeah, but you know what, Laura, your doctorate in just quickly, your doctorate in psychology and the training that you've done, that hasn't gone unnoticed, and believe me, that is so beneficial in so many ways. So honestly, good on you.
Massive. And I know we're running out of time, I think, but a hypothetical question, just thinking out loud. Male, female, couple on a mission together, engaged to be married. What are your thoughts on that as an addition to a mission?
Oh, big question. They did that in space once, right? They sent up a married couple. I don't know all the ins and outs of how that went. It'd be good to find out more. It has the potential. So is this the couple going out with other people?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess you've automatically got a clique there, right? Because two people know each other really well and others don't. That could cause a bit of friction.
Very good point.
Mm.
Yeah. And then I had Ilaria mention, she goes, well, you have to have the sex conversation immediately. And I went, okay, I guess we do have to have that conversation. What did you didn't even think of it. Honestly, it didn't even cross my mind.
Well, do you know what? It comes up in people who go solo as well. I won't share all the details, but if you're there away for a while, people have needs. You know, how do you manage that? These are great conversations to have and to think about. They're not really published. You can't really find this information in the literature, but it's a big consideration at some point.
All right, just a hypothetical.
Mm-hmm.
I think that couple in space were not openly couple. It was kind of a bit obscure. If they were only a couple, they wouldn't have flown, I think.
Yeah, that's correct. That's what I think too. Is like Mark Davis, Jan Davis, I think, were married but didn't tell NASA because they thought it would be a reason for NASA to bounce them from the flight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's funny that's an important consideration. And it's like, you know, what do you do with that? And you know, this is really interesting. I thought, Laura, especially because I've thought about, you know, there's question comes up about going to Mars, and I've thought for a long time, like, just the psychology of like seeing your home planet,
Oh yeah, the disappearing Earth. Yeah.
disappear, and you're locked in this cylinder container with other people, and your communication gets, 8 minutes round trip, 10 minutes round trip, 40 minutes round trip. If you're on opposite sides of the sun, you can't have a conversation with anybody.
No,
And the
no.
psychological impacts of that, of like really being isolated.
Yeah, and there's
Yeah.
been some analogs now where they do it under a time delay, right? To try and stimulate that effect.
Absolutely.
And we definitely need more of that, because it's a bit like what I was saying, the North Pole versus Mojave Desert, 3 hours for help that will come versus maybe, at the minimum 4 hours, but it could be 4 days, it could be a week. It makes a big difference psychologically to know that
Yeah.
you don't have that option.
Yeah. Essential to do that. You want to make it as high fidelity as possible.
Yeah, exactly.
We're doing we have a mission right now. They're coming out on Sunday at University of North Dakota, where I'm getting my PhD. And we're doing a 40-minute time delay. So 20 minutes, and you can tell it is becoming an issue. And this is 3 days left, right, until the mission's done. Well, 2 now. And I'm really interested to see the psychology surveys that are being done. I'm really interested to see those results. I think it's going to be fascinating. And that's Dario Shore is the PhD student who's out now. I think this is his dissertation. I'm fascinated to see what this is gonna look like. I'm really curious. Anyway.
Yeah. You have to keep us posted.
Well, you'll probably be the first to hear. How are we doing on our time, Ron? Do we have 8 minutes?
About 8 minutes left. Yeah, another great thought too about psychology not being a STEM, a core required subject, but
yeah,
I would think essential to a long duration mission. I mean, at least the astronauts in orbit can check in with Earth or find a doctor down here they could talk to. But if you're on your way to Mars, and it's got to be a specific and recognized role, just as like someone who's the networking expert or the comms expert, or the engineer who fixes things.
I think it's one of those things where in the field it's really valued. Like when you read around the literature, particularly from like NASA astronauts, they really value speaking with a psychologist. They credit it to staying sane, but then that doesn't always translate to sort of how things are viewed outside of that. I think it's maybe a bit of a bias that it's not a hard science like chemistry or physics, therefore it's not as valuable. Maybe there's a slight sort of subconscious gender bias there. Psychology is a healthcare field, it's more of a caring field. I don't know. I don't know exactly what it's about. I think we are really valued, just that isn't necessarily coming through in terms of who's allowed to be what, and who's allowed to go where.
They require a medical doctor on board, right?
Yep. Yeah.
I'm gonna jump in there. Sorry, I'm gonna jump in there. Also, because I Laura and I actually attended the same university. Not together, but that's how we met, through the same supervisor. And psychology, because I do psychology as well, and it's one of those non-sciences purely because it's human behavior, and you can't put a statistic on human behavior. And that's primarily the one thing I've seen of why people don't label it as a science, even though there are so many fields within psychology that absolutely are and use the scientific method. So absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, NASA, if you're a clinical psychologist, you can apply to work at NASA. I don't know if that would affect your chances of being an astronaut. I guess it would. But you can work at NASA as part of the human behavior performance team with a clinical psychology degree, but they don't seem to recognize other forms of psychology degrees. I'm not entirely sure why, but yeah.
It's interesting you bring that up. So the HRP folks at JSC, not JSC Houston. They're really keen on this Arctic work that we're doing. And I think it's because kind of what you've highlighted, right, is the extreme in isolation, totally confined. There's no help. It's hours, if not days or a week away, maybe longer, depending on the fog. And they're really keen to participate. And I've only found out about this recently through a friend who works for KBR there. Anyway, I haven't made the announcement yet on who all's on the team, but we've got a really solid team. I'm going to do that today or tomorrow. I didn't want to cast too much attention on them, but you know, it's a significant event, and what you did, backpacks on sleds, and come on, that's just high level extreme. That's pretty crazy.
Thank you. Thank
Well,
you.
to put it in perspective, Laura, I worked for a big company here in Ireland, and we had a big CEO, billionaire, so big time. And he spent a year telling us how he's planning to take this thing in North Pole slashes and like go there, and how he's training and he's this and that and the other thing. And then quietly later, we learned that he failed at the first like day. He just got out. He couldn't do it. So, your training career out. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much. I'll tell you one quick story before we leave, because yeah, so our expedition, it was kind of interesting the way that it worked out, because the first day was full on. I think we did about a 28-hour stint or something on the first day. We then had 2.5 days confined to tents, and then on our last day we also had another like crazy stint, because we're just following the weather windows, right? So you go when the weather's good, whatever that means. So yeah, on the first day we had a bad storm hit, and it was interesting to kind of see how that played out, and you know how I felt as well. So we had a bad storm hit, so our visibility was maybe 10 to 20 meters. We've been told by all of the locals that the area we were going to was full of polar bears, big aggressive males. It's mating season. We were going to see them, maybe multiple bears. So we all kind of had that in mind. And so we pitched a tent as the storm got worse, and quite quickly the Felicity was out on bear watch, and she thought she'd seen something. So I got called out for a second opinion. I couldn't quite make out what it was, but she's been in those environments a lot, and she seemed quite sure that it was probably a bear. So we had to make a decision about what we were going to do, because we had flares, we had bullets, but we had very high winds, so the flares would have just diverted. And yes, we could have used the bullets, but it's not ideal to be shooting at a polar bear in the first instance, right? You want to try and scare it off. So we ended up packing up the tent and then going back to a bit closer to land, because you're much safer on the land because they hunt out on the sea ice. So we just wanted to get a little bit more sheltered. And that whole journey back to a safer spot was pretty terrifying. Goggles were almost completely frozen up. You've got these tiny points of visibility at various points during that ski. Different team members could see things moving around us. Felicity thinks it was probably the same bear that was like stalking us, which is quite a scary feeling. When you're out there, you can't see very well. Yes, you've had some firearm training, but not very much, you know, comparatively. It's not like I do that for a living. It's pretty intense, the kind of feelings that come up. but also really fun. I mean, obviously we're all safe and well. Nothing happened, but it was a great experience to have gone through.
I guess you won't get a polar bear on the way to Mars, but
No.
You might have something equally or more life-threatening.
Oh yeah, definitely. Mars would 100% be more challenging than the polar bear. At least we had, you know, we had a gun, we could use it.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and
yeah, I think that's us at time, isn't it? Bang on.
thanks so much, Laura. And
thanks everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Tahani. Good to see you, Mikhail.